Sarah stayed out on the back porch nearly 15 minutes. Through the window, I watched her standing near Carol's old rose bushes, still blooming stubborn and red against the fence. Carol used to say if you tended something long enough, it eventually bloomed. Sometimes people were the same. Sometimes they weren't. Michael finally looked up. Dad, I didn't answer. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. No, I said quietly. You don't. He swallowed. But I didn't want to humiliate you. Then what did you want? He searched for an answer that didn't exist. I didn't want conflict. So avoiding conflict meant embarrassing your father instead. It wasn't supposed to happen at the door. Michael, whether you cut me out at the entrance or by email a week earlier wouldn't have changed a thing. He looked away. The decision had already been made long before I ever put on that suit. Sarah came back inside a few minutes later, eyes red, and sat without looking at either of us. I called my mom. Michael looked up. Why? Because I wanted to know if she knew. Sarah stared straight ahead. She didn't. What? My parents thought you wanted the ceremony small on your side. They had no idea your own father wasn't invited. Her voice cracked. My dad asked twice why you weren't at the rehearsal dinner. I told him you said Thomas wasn't feeling well. She shook her head. I defended you. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. I wasn't shocked. Once people tell one lie, they usually need another to protect it, and eventually they lose track of which version they told to whom. Sarah reached into her bag. I found something else. I wasn't looking for it. I was digging for our insurance paperwork. She set several credit card statements on the table. Michael already knew where this was going. Sarah, don't. Explain these. Charges from steakhouses, a ski resort, a jewelry store, a leased sports coupe. Michael rubbed his temples. I can explain. Please do. Some of it was client entertainment. She slid another statement toward him. 4,000 at a jewelry counter. Silence. Business he offered weekly. Still nothing. I stood quietly. This isn't my conversation. No, Thomas, Sarah said. You should hear this. Michael looked miserable. Finally, he admitted it. I didn't want anyone thinking I couldn't provide. Sarah stared. So while your father was covering our mortgage, you were spending on watches and ski trips to look successful? He nodded slowly. I thought the business would turn around. I don't know. You bought a car. I was trying to look successful. You bought vacations. I thought it mattered how things looked. Sarah laughed, bitter. It mattered more than the truth did. Something clicked for me right then. Something that had bothered me for a while without a name. Michael had never had to ask me for more because he never had to. He already knew I'd quietly fix the biggest hole every month. That left whatever he actually earned free to spend on looking the part for everyone else. Not because he was cruel. Because he'd gotten hooked on appearances, and I'd unknowingly kept the supply running. That realization hurt nearly as much as the wedding had. Sarah looked at me. Thomas, I'm so ashamed. You didn't build this, I said gently. No, but I lived inside it. She wasn't wrong. Whether she'd known about the mortgage or not, she'd been living in the home my money quietly protected. She turned back to Michael. You know what actually hurts the most? You didn't trust me enough to struggle alongside you. I was trying to give you a better life. You gave me a fake one. Michael suddenly looked at me. Are you going to let us lose the house? It was the first question he'd asked all morning that wasn't about himself. There was real fear behind it. I answered honestly. I don't know. Sarah looked startled. You don't know? I spent 2.5 years preventing consequences. I leaned back. Maybe it's time consequences taught the lesson I couldn't. Michael's eyes filled. They'll foreclose. Not tomorrow. But eventually if you can't catch up. If you have the money. I don't, he said, and for the first time he told the whole truth. Business wasn't just slow, it was sinking. 2 jobs had gone unpaid. A supplier was threatening to sue over an outstanding balance. Cards were maxed. The business account barely covered next week's parts order. I listened without interrupting. 2.5 years earlier, I would have had my checkbook open before he finished the sentence. Now I just listened. When he finished, I asked one question. Have you told Sarah all of this? He shook his head. Sarah closed her eyes. So the mortgage wasn't the only thing you kept from me. No. She looked exhausted. I married a man. Turns out I married a performance. That afternoon they left together. Not because anything had been resolved, but because nothing had, yet. At the door, Michael stopped. Dad, I really am sorry. I believed he meant it this time, but regret and responsibility aren't the same currency. I know. Can we fix this? I looked past him toward Carol's roses. Broken trust doesn't get repaired with promises. It gets repaired with choices. He nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not sure you do yet. He took that without arguing. For the first time in years, he left my house without asking me for a single thing. 3 days later, I got a call from the credit union, a loan officer confirming the recurring transfers had permanently stopped. I told her. Thank you, Mr. Reyes. Before hanging up, she added, the homeowners have contacted us directly requesting a hardship modification. So they'd finally started talking to the bank themselves instead of waiting on me. That was progress. Small but real. I went out that evening with a watering can for Carol's roses. Pouring water around their roots. Something settled in me. Love isn't always giving people what they want. Sometimes it's stepping back far enough that they finally become who they were supposed to be. Whether Michael made it through this would depend on him now, not on me. About 2 weeks passed before I heard from him again. No text this time. No call. On a gray Thursday afternoon, he showed up at my door with a cardboard box. He looked different. Not younger, not healthier exactly, but the confidence that always seemed tied to expensive gear was gone. He looked honest. Can I come in? I nodded. He set the box on the table. Inside were 2 watches, an unopened tablet, a set of golf clubs, a leather bag still with the tags on. Cleaning house, he said, managing a weak smile. Selling whatever isn't necessary. That's a start. Won't cover much. No, but that's not the point. He took a cup of coffee and we sat quietly for a while. Finally he spoke. I met with the bank. How'd it go? They agreed to pause the foreclosure process. If we make 3 payments on our own on time, they'll modify the loan. And can you? I don't know. For the first time in years, he wasn't pretending to have the answer. Oddly, that gave me some hope. A few days later, Sarah called and asked if I'd meet her for lunch. We sat at a diner halfway between our 2 towns, the kind of place where the waitress calls everyone by their first name. She looked tired but resolved. I wanted to tell you something before Michael does. She said, I sold my engagement ring. I looked up. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She smiled sadly. It wasn't the diamond that made us married. What did you do with the money? Paid off 2 of the credit cards. I couldn't help smiling. Carol would have liked that answer. She stirred her tea. I was angry with you for a while. I know. But I think I understand now. You weren't trying to punish us. You were forcing us to actually look at things. Exactly. I wish we'd learned that sooner. So do I. Over the following weeks, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends. Michael sold one of his shop trucks, dropped a country club membership I never even knew he had, stopped leasing equipment he barely used. He started taking on smaller jobs himself instead of farming everything out to subcontractors. Hal ran into him at the hardware store one afternoon. Your boy was loading rebar into his own truck, Hal told me, helping me stack cordwood. Never seen him do that. I used to. Hello, good. Maybe he's finally becoming a mechanic instead of pretending to run an empire. Then came a call I hadn't expected. Dad, I need a favor. I waited. Not money, he said quickly. I need advice. The bank wants a real budget. I've never made one. You've run a shop for 8 years. I know. I just always figured next month would fix this month. Long silence. Come over, I said. For the next 4 hours, we sat at my kitchen table surrounded by receipts, tax forms, invoices, and a legal pad. I taught him what my own father had taught me. Every dollar gets a job before you spend it. We split everything into 3 piles. Necessary, optional, waste. The waste pile grew embarrassingly large. Streaming subscriptions he'd forgotten about, a leased SUV, gym passes nobody used, client dinners that never produced a single job. I can't believe I let it get this bad, Michael said, rubbing his forehead. It didn't happen overnight. No. One excuse at a time. He looked at me. I sound like you. Not the worst thing you could sound like. As we wrapped up, he asked quietly, "Can I ask you something? When you stopped paying, were you trying to hurt me?" "No," I said honestly. "I was trying to stop hurting myself." He frowned. "I don't understand. I spent years thinking love meant shielding you from every consequence. I folded the budget sheets. But every month I solved your problem, I gave you permission not to solve it yourself." He was quiet a long while. "I never saw it that way. I know. I thought I was helping. I was. But helping and rescuing aren't the same thing." A week later, Michael asked me to meet him somewhere. He drove me out to one of his job sites. Not a fancy build, just a modest bungalow owned by an elderly widow. He introduced me to Mrs. Ferris, who smiled warmly. "Your son refuses to overcharge me." Michael looked embarrassed. "I just charge what the work costs." Mrs. Ferris laughed. "He told me he'd rather build trust than pad an invoice." Walking back to the truck, I glanced at him. "That's new." He smiled. "Been thinking about what you said." "Which part?" "Mom used to say character isn't what you show the people watching." I stopped walking. "You remember that?" "I remember all of it. I just forgot to live by it." Before he left that evening, he set an envelope on my kitchen table. "Open it later." After he left, I did. Inside was a handwritten letter, not typed, not rushed. "Dad, I kept wondering why you never yelled at me. Now I know. The silence gave me room to hear my own mistakes without anyone else's voice in the way. I can't undo the wedding. I can't give you back that day. But I promise you'll never again have to wonder where you stand with me. I want to earn your trust back, not buy it. Michael." I folded the letter and slid it inside Carol's cedar box, next to her old letters. For the first time since that terrible afternoon in Denver, the box finally held something worth keeping alongside her. Autumn settled in slow that year. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, then bare, and for the first time in a long while I caught myself looking forward instead of back. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one honest conversation, one hard decision, one kept promise at a time. Michael was learning that. So was I. 3 months after the wedding, another envelope showed up in my mailbox. This one wasn't printed by an expensive stationer. Not even, no gold foil. Just a plain white envelope, my name written across the front in Michael's own handwriting. Inside was a single card. "Dad, would you come to dinner Sunday? I already saved you a seat." I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. That Sunday, I drove the hour back to Aurora. Same highway, same truck. Only this time I wasn't carrying a wedding gift. I was carrying Carol's cedar box. Pulling into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was what wasn't there. The leased SUV was gone. The landscaping cruise sign was gone. The overpriced patio set had been swapped for a plain wooden picnic table. The place looked lived in instead of staged. Sarah opened the door before I made it up the walk, and this time she didn't just smile. She hugged me. "I'm really glad you came." "So am I." Inside, the smell of pot roast filled the house. The same smell Carol used to fill our kitchen with every Sunday. Somewhere down the hall, a small voice, Sarah's little niece, visiting for the weekend, shrieked, "Grandpa Tom's here." I hadn't realized how much I'd missed hearing anything close to that word. Then Michael walked in. He looked healthier, not richer. Jeans, a flannel shirt, sawdust still clinging to one sleeve. He looked more like the boy who used to help me stack fence posts than the man who'd spent years pretending to be someone else. Without a word, he handed me a framed photograph. Their wedding portrait. I recognized it right away, except something had changed. The original showed Michael and Sarah flanked by her parents. This one had been carefully edited, not to rewrite the day, but to create the memory that should have existed. There I was, standing beside my son, exactly where I belonged. I looked up. His eyes were already wet. "I know it isn't real," he said. "No," I said softly. "It isn't. I can't change what happened." "I know. But I wanted you to see it. That's where you always belonged." I set the frame down and hugged my son for the first time in longer than either of us could probably count. Neither of us said anything else. Sometimes silence is finally the right thing. Dinner was simple. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, dinner rolls, no caterers, no string lights, no seating chart. Just family. As we finished dessert, Michael stood and tapped his glass with a fork. I want to say something. Everyone turned, including Sarah's parents, visiting for the weekend. He looked straight at me. I owe someone an apology I should have given a long time ago. The table went quiet. When I planned our wedding, I cared more about how it looked than about honoring the man who spent his whole life taking care of me. I convinced myself appearances were the same thing as success. They're not. He paused. The strongest man I know drove an hour to be there for me, and I left him standing outside. Sarah reached for his hand. I'll regret that for a long time. He turned to his in-laws. I owe you both an apology too. I let you believe things about that day that weren't true. Sarah's father stood slowly. I remember wondering where you were, Thomas. I should have asked harder. He crossed the room and put out his hand. I'm sorry. I shook it. So am I. There wasn't any bitterness left in it. Just a quiet sadness for time neither of us would get back. After dinner, Michael and I sat out on the back steps while the kids chased fireflies across the yard. Bank approved the modification, he said. Congratulations. We've made every payment ourselves since. I know you have. He smiled. Asked Denise how you were doing. You've still got friends in low places. I've got friends, period. He looked out over the yard. I almost asked if you'd start helping again. I raised an eyebrow. Almost. I realized if I asked, I'd be proving I hadn't actually learned anything. You've learned plenty. We're gonna finish paying it off ourselves. And when we do, he grinned. I'm taking you fishing somewhere that isn't Hal's Pond. I laughed. As long as it's a round trip. He looked confused for half a second, then burst out laughing. So did I. First time we'd laughed together like that in longer than I wanted to admit. Before I drove home, he walked me out to the truck. As I opened the door, he stopped me. Dad. Yeah. I used to think making it meant a bigger garage and a nicer truck. He glanced back toward the porch, where Sarah stood waving with the kids. Now I think making it just means the people you love still pick up when you call. I put a hand on his shoulder. Don't waste that. I won't. When I got home that night, I set Carol's cedar box on the living room shelf. Inside were her letters, Michael's handwritten note, and now the new photograph. Not because it erased what happened, nothing ever really does, but because it reminded me that forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past. It just gives the future room to breathe. Carol used to say families aren't held together by getting everything right. They're held together by humility. Someone has to admit they were wrong, and someone has to choose to forgive them for it. Both of those take more courage than most people ever give them credit for. If you're reading this, maybe there's someone in your own life you've been taking for granted, or someone you've been putting off forgiving. Don't wait for a wedding or a funeral or a crisis to remind you what actually matters. Tell the people you love that you love them while they're still around to hear it. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday when the screaming started. Elena had stepped into the adjoining bathroom to wash her face. She rushed back into the room to find Sophia thrashing violently against the bed rails, tearing at her foreline. They're coming, Sophia shrieked, her eyes wide and unseeing. Marco, they have guns. Hide the boy. It's okay. You're safe, Elena said, moving in quickly, trying to pin the frail wrists before the four ripped out. But the old woman had a sudden, frantic strength. Her fingernails caught Elena's cheek, scratching a deep, stinging line down to her jaw. The oak doors slammed open. Vincent burst in, his suit jacket gone, a holstered gun strapped across his chest over a white dress shirt. His eyes were wild. What happened? What did you do? He barked, closing the distance in 3 strides. Nothing. She's having an episode. Elena grunted, struggling to hold Sophia's arm steady. Don't yell. You're making it worse. Vincent ignored her. He reached for his mother. Ma, stop. It's Vincent. You're fine. Don't touch him, Sophia screamed, looking right at Vincent, but seeing a monster. She spat in his face. Murderer. You took my husband. Murderer. Vincent froze. The word struck him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face and his hands dropped to his sides. He looked entirely, utterly broken. "Get out," Elena ordered. Vincent just stood there, the spit slowly dripping down his cheek. "Vincent, get out of the room. Now." Elena used her command voice, the one that snapped residents and doctors alike into line. He blinked, slowly backing away before turning and stumbling out into the hallway. It took Elena 20 minutes to calm Sophia down. She used soft tones, humming a nameless tune, gently stroking the woman's hair until the frantic energy burned itself out and the sedative took hold. Once Sophia's breathing deepened into a steady rhythm, Elena checked the floor, adjusted the blankets, and slumped back into her armchair. Her cheek was throbbing. She wiped it with the back of her hand and saw a smear of blood. Sighing, she stood up and walked out into the dark hallway. She headed for the massive stainless steel kitchen on the main floor. She needed ice. She needed caffeine. The kitchen was dark except for the amber glow of the undercabinet lighting. Vincent was sitting at the massive marble island. A bottle of bourbon sat half empty in front of him. He still had the shoulder holster on. Elena didn't retreat. She walked to the industrial fridge, pulled out a bag of frozen peas, and pressed it against her cheek. Then she went to the espresso machine. "She doesn't know what she's saying," Elena said quietly over the grinding of the coffee beans. Vincent didn't look up from his glass. "Dementia is a disease of truth, Elena. It strips away the polite lies we tell ourselves. What's left is what they really think. That's garbage." Elena poured the espresso into a mug. "It's misfired synapses. It's a dying brain trying to make sense of shadows. Don't flatter yourself into thinking it's poetry." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" "I don't have the energy to." Elena walked over to the island and sat on a stool opposite him. She didn't ask for permission. She set her mug down and kept the peas pressed to her face. Vincent finally looked up. He looked at the makeshift ice pack, then at her eyes. "She hurt you. Occupational hazard. I pay you enough to deal with it, right?" His tone was mocking, trying to push her away, trying to re-establish the cold boundary between boss and employee. Elena didn't take the bait. "You pay me to keep her comfortable. The scratches are free." A heavy silence settled over the kitchen. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Vincent stared at his glass, tracing the rim with his thumb. Elena drank her coffee black. It was a bizarre domesticity. The crime boss and the burnt-out nurse sharing the dead hours of the night. "My father," Vincent said softly, breaking the silence. "He was in the life. He was shot in our driveway when I was 12. She was looking out the window when it happened. Sometimes she gets confused. She thinks I'm the man who pulled the trigger." Elena lowered the bag of peas. She looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the tailored clothes and the guns and the fear he commanded, he was just a son watching his mother rot from the inside out. "I'm sorry," Elena said. It was the only thing to say. Vincent met her gaze. The exhaustion in his eyes was mirrored in hers. He looked down at her hands resting on the marble counter. They were red from washing, calloused. Then he looked at her shoes. The cheap clogs were peeling at the seams. He didn't say anything else. He just finished his drink, stood up, and walked out of the kitchen. The next evening, when Elena arrived for her shift, there was a box sitting on the chair in Sophia's room. Inside was a pair of high-end custom support nursing shoes. They were exactly her size. There was no note. Elena stared at them for a long time. She hated that they were exactly what she needed. She hated that she put them on, and she really hated how perfectly they fit. The illusion of safety shattered 3 weeks later. It was raining again. The house felt restless. The guards outside were pacing more frequently, and the men inside spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Vincent hadn't been in to see his mother for 2 days. At 3 a.m., the heavy oak doors to Sophia's room didn't open. They were kicked in. Elena jumped up from her chair, her heart slamming against her ribs. Vincent stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. He was physically supporting Marco, the massive guard who usually manned the front gate. Marco's face was ashen, his lips blue, his hands clamped over his stomach, and dark, thick blood was pouring between his fingers, dripping onto the pristine floorboards. "Clear the table," Vincent snarled, his voice tight with panic and adrenaline. Elena didn't ask questions. Training overrode terror. She swept the medication trays and water pitchers off the large exam table in the corner of the room. Crashed to the floor. Sophia, mercifully sedated, didn't even stir. Vincent hauled Marco over and dropped him onto the table. The man let out a wet, rattling groan. What happened? Elena asked, snapping on 2 pairs of gloves. She grabbed her trauma shears and started cutting away Marco's blood-soaked shirt. Drive-by. They hit the gate, Vincent said. He pulled off his own jacket. His white shirt was smeared with crimson. I need you to fix him. Fix him? Elena stared at the massive hole in Marco's abdomen. Blood was pulsing out in a steady, terrifying rhythm. He needs a hospital, Vincent. He needs a surgeon. It hit an artery. He can't go to a hospital, Vincent said, stepping closer. His voice dropped, turning cold and absolute. If he goes to an ER, the cops get called. If the cops get called, this house gets raided. You fix him. I'm a nurse, not a trauma surgeon. Elena yelled, pressing a massive stack of gauze into the wound. Marco screamed, his back arching off the table. I don't have the tools. I don't have blood for a transfusion, and I don't have anesthesia. He is going to die on this table. Vincent grabbed her by the shoulders. His hands were strong, desperate. Elena, look at me. She snapped her head up, her eyes wide and terrified. You are going to stop the bleeding, Vincent said, his dark eyes boring into hers. You are going to keep him alive until my private doctor gets here in 40 minutes. Do you understand me? Elena looked at Marco. His eyes were rolling back. The pulse under her fingers was thready, racing like a terrified bird. She looked back at Vincent. The sheer gravity of his presence pulled her out of her panic. Get over here and put pressure on this, Elena ordered. Vincent immediately moved to her side, pressing his large hands over hers, driving the gauze deep into the wound. Harder. Lean your weight into it. She spun around to her medical cart. She grabbed saline bags, tearing them open with her teeth. She spiked the bags, found a vein in Marco's uninjured arm, and started pushing fluids as fast as they would go to keep his blood pressure from bottoming out. He needs to stay awake, Elena said, rushing back to the table. She grabbed clamps from a sterile kit she kept for minor procedures. Marco, hey, look at me. Keep your eyes open. Marco blinked, his gaze unfocused. Boss, I'm here, Marco, Vincent said. His voice was steady, completely devoid of the panic he had shown seconds earlier. He was the boss again. Absolute control. You're not dying today. Understand? Elena pushed Vincent's hands aside and dug into the wound with the clamps. The blood was slick, blinding her. She operated on pure instinct and anatomy recall. She felt the severed edge of a vessel. She clamped it. The geyser of blood slowed to a sluggish weep. Elena let out a ragged breath, her shoulders dropping. I got the bleeder, but he's going into shock. Where the hell is your doctor? 10 minutes, Vincent said softly. They stood there in the blood-soaked room. Marco passed out, but his breathing was steady. Elena stepped back from the table, peeling off her bloody gloves. Her hands were shaking violently now that the adrenaline was crashing. She walked over to the small sink in the corner and turned on the hot water. She scrubbed her hands with industrial soap, watching the pink foam spiral down the drain. Vincent walked up behind her. He didn't say anything. He just reached out, turned on the cold water beside her hot, and started washing his own hands in the same sink. Their shoulders brushed. He smelled like gunpowder, copper, and expensive cologne. Your hands didn't shake, Vincent said quietly, his voice a low rumble over the sound of the running water. Not until it was over. Hazard pay, Elena said, her voice rough. I want double hazard pay for this. Vincent let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. He reached for a towel and handed it to her. As she took it, his fingers brushed hers. They lingered. The touch was entirely intentional. You can have whatever you want, Elena, he said, looking down at her. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by something much sharper and much more dangerous. Anything. Elena looked up at him. She knew she should look away. She knew she should grab her bag, walk out the front door, and never come back to this house of blood and ghosts. But she didn't. She couldn't because for the first time in years, someone was looking at her like she mattered, even if he was a monster. Dr. Reyes did not ask for a patient history. He arrived 38 minutes after the call carrying a black leather bag that looked heavy enough to contain bowling balls. He was a man in his 60s with an immaculate silver beard and a gray tailored suit. He walked into Sophia's bedroom, stepped over the shattered glass of the fallen medication tray, and looked at Marco, bleeding out on the exam table. Then he looked at Elena. "You clamped the hepatic artery?" Reyes asked, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "I couldn't tell you what it was," Elena said, stepping back so he could take over. Her scrubs were ruined. The copper stench of blood hung heavy in the air, masking the lavender. "I just found the pulsing and shut it off." Reyes grunted. He opened his bag. It was a portable trauma bay. "You saved his life. I'll take it from here. Go wash up." Elena didn't argue. She walked to the bathroom, stripped off her scrubs, and threw them directly into the trash can. She stood under the scalding spray of the shower, watching the water turn pink, then clear, circling the drain. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but her chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the adrenaline. When she stepped back out into the bedroom, wearing a spare set of scrubs she always kept in her locker, Marco was gone. The table had been wiped down with industrial bleach. Dr. Reyes was nowhere to be seen. Only Vincent remained. He was sitting in the armchair by his mother's bed. He had changed his shirt, a fresh, crisp white button-down. But the holster was still there. "Marco?" Elena asked, her voice raspy. "Guest bedroom," Vincent said, staring at his sleeping mother. "Reyes brought a nurse. He's stable. He'll live." Elena started picking up the fallen medication bottles. "Leave it," Vincent commanded softly. "The cleaning crew will handle it in the morning." Elena stopped, a bottle of heart medication in her hand. She placed it carefully on the nightstand. She looked at the clock. It was 5:15 a.m. "Walk with me," Vincent said. He stood up. It wasn't a request. Elena followed him out of the room. They didn't head toward the kitchen. Vincent turned left at the grand staircase, walking toward the heavy, iron-reinforced doors that separated the main house from the east wing, the forbidden zone. He keyed a code into the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical clunk. He pushed the doors open and held one for her.
Elena hesitated.
Rule 2. The east wing is completely off-limits. "You crossed a line tonight, Elena," Vincent said, watching her hesitation. His eyes were flat, unreadable. "You saved one of my men. You saw the blood. You're already in. You might as well see the rest." She stepped through. The East Wing didn't look like a crime boss's hideout. It looked like a high-end corporate office. Thick Persian rugs muffled their footsteps. The walls were lined with mahogany bookshelves and original oil paintings. At the end of the hall was Vincent's office. It was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city below, the lights flickering through the driving rain. A massive oak desk sat in the center of the room. There were no guns on the desk, no bricks of cash, just a sleek laptop, stacks of manila folders, and a crystal decanter. Vincent walked to a small safe behind his desk. He opened it, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it onto the polished wood. It hit the desk with a heavy thud. "Hazard pay," Vincent said. "Count it." Elena approached the desk. She opened the flap. Stacks of $100 bills stared back at her. It had to be at least $20,000. Maybe more. "I can't take this," Elena said, dropping the envelope. "I get paid by the agency," Elena added. "The agency pays you a fraction of what you're worth, and you know it." Vincent poured 2 glasses of scotch from the decanter. He pushed one across the desk toward her. "Take it, Elena. The IRS doesn't care where the money comes from as long as they get it, and your landlord doesn't care either." Elena looked at the amber liquid in the glass, then at the envelope. She was drowning in debt. This envelope was a lifeline, but it was a lifeline tied to an anchor. "If I take this," Elena said quietly, "does it mean I work for you? Or do I work for the agency?" "You work for me," Vincent stated. You always did. The agency was just paperwork. He walked around the desk, stopping 2 feet away from her. He smelled like clean linen and smoke. The exhaustion in his face was a permanent fixture, but beneath it was a raw, coiled energy. You didn't run tonight, Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave. Any other nurse would have been screaming for the police. You clamped a bleeding artery with zero hesitation. Why? Because a man was dying on my table, Elena replied, holding her ground. She met his gaze directly. I don't care if he's a saint or a soldier. My job is to stop the bleeding. That's all. Vincent studied her face. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her bruised cheek where his mother had scratched her weeks ago. He didn't touch her. He just let his hand fall. Take the money, Elena, he whispered. Go home. Sleep. I'll see you tomorrow night. Elena took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. She walked out of the east wing, the mechanical lock clicking shut behind her, sealing her on the other side. But she knew the truth. She wasn't an outsider anymore. Elena's apartment was a miserable, cramped studio on the 2nd floor of a decaying brick building. It smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. It was a jarring transition from the sprawling, silent luxury of the Marchetti estate. She got home at 9 a.m., exhausted to the marrow of her bones. She dropped the manila envelope onto her cheap Formica kitchen counter. She hadn't counted it. She didn't want to know the exact price of her complicity. She just wanted to sleep. Elena stripped down, threw on an oversized t-shirt, and collapsed into her unmade bed. She slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of the dead. She woke up to the sound of breaking glass. It was 3 p.m. The afternoon sun was slicing through the gap in her cheap blinds. Elena sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard heavy footsteps in her small kitchenette.
Elena.
A voice called out, slurred, angry. Ryan, her ex-husband, the man who had forged her signature on 2 separate business loans, gambled away their savings, and left her holding the bag when the creditors came calling. Elena grabbed the heavy metal flashlight she kept by her nightstand and stepped out of the bedroom. Ryan was standing by the counter. He looked worse than the last time she saw him. His face was puffy, his clothes wrinkled and smelling of stale beer and desperation. He had knocked over a glass of water, which shattered on the linoleum. But he wasn't looking at the glass. He was holding the manila envelope. He had torn it open. The stacks of hundreds were scattered across the counter. Ryan's eyes were wide, manic. Where did you get this? He demanded, looking up at her. You holding out on me, Elena? Crying poor while you've got this sitting on your counter? Put it down, Ryan, Elena said, her voice dangerously calm. Her grip on the flashlight tightened. Get out of my apartment. Or what? Ryan sneered, shoving a stack of bills into his jacket pocket. I need this, Elena. I owe people. Bad people. And those are my bills. Elena stepped forward. I said put it down. Ryan laughed. A bitter, ugly sound. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her bicep. You owe me, Elena. You left me when things got hard. He didn't finish the sentence. The door to the apartment hadn't been locked. Ryan had broken the flimsy chain, and now the door swung open silently. A shadow filled the doorway. It was Tomas, one of Vincent's quiet, massive guards, who usually brought Elena her dinner trays. He was wearing a dark suit, his face completely impassive. He stepped into the apartment. Ryan turned, confused. Tomas didn't say a word. He simply reached out, grabbed Ryan by the collar of his jacket, and pulled him away from Elena with the effortless strength of a machine. Before Ryan could even yell, Tomas slammed him face first into the wall. The drywall cracked. Ryan crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, blood pouring from his broken nose. Tomas looked at the scattered cash, then at Elena. Are you injured, ma'am? No, Elena breathed, staring at the crumpled form of her ex-husband. What are you doing here? Mr. Marchetti requested a security detail be placed on you after the incident at the house last night, Tomas stated matter-of-factly. He reached down, grabbed Ryan by the back of his belt, and hoisted him to his feet like a piece of luggage. "I will handle this." "Wait," Elena started. But Tomas was already dragging a sobbing, bleeding Ryan out the door. "The lock needs replacing," Tomas noted, pausing at the threshold. "I will have a team here in 20 minutes. The door clicked shut. Elena stood alone in her apartment. The scattered money lay on the counter. The blood was on her wall. The sheer, suffocating reach of Vincent Marchetti had just wrapped its hands around her personal life. She didn't wait for the team. She threw on clothes, grabbed the envelope, and drove straight back to the hills. It was 4:30 p.m. The sun was starting to set. The guards at the gate recognized her car and opened the iron jaws without a word. Elena parked, stormed past Marco's replacement at the front door, and marched directly toward the east wing. She punched in the code she had memorized from the night before, 6183. The lock clicked. She threw the doors open and walked down the plush hall. She burst into Vincent's office without knocking. Vincent was sitting at his desk on the phone. He looked up, mildly surprised, then spoke quietly into the receiver. "I'll call you back." He hung up. Elena marched up to his desk and slammed the manila envelope down. The remaining cash spilled out. "You had me followed," Elena yelled, her voice echoing in the large room. Vincent leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely calm. "I had you protected. There's a difference. I am not your property, Vincent. I am your employee." Elena was shaking, the anger boiling over, mixing with the lingering adrenaline from the break-in. "You don't get to send your thugs into my home. You don't get to handle my problems. Your problem was stealing from you and bruising your arm," Vincent said. His eyes flicked to her bicep. Elena looked down. There were already dark purple finger marks blooming on her skin. Vincent stood up. The calm vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying intensity. He walked around the desk and stood in front of her. "You work for me, Elena. That means you are under my protection," Vincent said, his voice a low rumble. "That man has $180,000 in gambling debts with a crew out of the docks. If they came looking for him, they would have found you." Elena stared at him. The wind knocked out of her sails. "What? I bought his debt this morning," Vincent stated. "He doesn't owe them anymore. He owes me, which means he will never, ever come within 100 yards of you again." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. The sheer scale of what he had done, the casual way he deployed his power to rewrite her reality, was staggering. "Why?"
Elena whispered.
"Why would you do that?" Vincent looked down at her. The harsh lines of his face softened just a fraction. "Because you're the only person in my life who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. And because you keep my mother breathing. I protect what matters to me." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing over the bruising on her arm. His touch was jarringly soft. "Go home, Elena. Your new locks are installed by now. I'll see you at 8. Elena left the money on the desk. She walked out of the office, her chest tight, realizing with terrifying clarity that the iron gates of the estate hadn't just locked the danger out. They had locked her in, and she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Sophia's decline was steep and sudden. 2 weeks after the drive-by, the brief periods of lucidity vanished entirely. They were replaced by a profound, hollow silence. She stopped eating. The 4 fluids were the only things keeping her organs functioning. The scent of lavender in her room was slowly being replaced by the distinct metallic scent of a body shutting down. Elena knew the signs. She had walked this path 100 times with 100 different families. But she had never walked it with Vincent Marchetti. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday. The house was dead quiet. A heavy fog had rolled in from the coast, pressing against the glass windows of the mansion like a physical weight. Elena was adjusting Sophia's blankets when Vincent walked in. He looked terrible. The tailored suits were gone. He wore sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt. He hadn't shaved in days. The crime boss was gone. Only the grieving son remained. He pulled the leather chair up to the side of the bed and sat down heavily. He reached out and took his mother's hand.
"Manantay," he whispered.
Sophia didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rattling sound accompanying each exhale. Vincent dropped his head, resting his forehead against the mattress. His shoulders shook just once. A silent, violent tremor. Elena stood by the medical cart watching him. Her professional boundary, the invisible wall she built between herself and the families of the dying, was crumbling. Her vitals are dropping, Vincent, Elena said softly, breaking the silence. Her blood pressure is 70/40. It won't be long. Vincent didn't look up. How long? Days? Maybe hours. It's impossible to tell, but she isn't in pain. Vincent slowly lifted his head. He looked at his mother's frail, sunken face. Then he looked at Elena. His eyes were red-rimmed, stripped of all their usual armor. I built all this. Vincent gestured vaguely to the opulent room, the fortress outside. Killed men. I bought politicians. I built an empire so she would never have to be afraid again. So no one could ever hurt her like they hurt my father. He let out a broken laugh. And I can't do a damn thing about this. I have all the power in the world, and I can't buy her one more day. Elena walked around the bed. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it was God's plan, or that his mother was going to a better place. She gave him the only thing that actually mattered in the dark. The truth. No, you can't, Elena said, standing beside his chair. Power doesn't matter here. Money doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you're here, that she isn't alone. Vincent stood up. The sudden movement was jarring. He turned to face Elena. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. I'm always alone, Elena, he said, his voice cracking. He didn't step back. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Elena looked up into his eyes, seeing the raw, bleeding grief, the crushing isolation of a man who lived his life surrounded by people he paid to be there. Elena reached up. She didn't overthink it. She didn't weigh the consequences or remember the rules. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating frantically like a trapped animal. Vincent inhaled sharply. He looked down at her hand, then back up to her face. You're not alone tonight, Elena whispered. Vincent moved before she could take another breath. His hands came up, framing her face. His palms were rough, calloused, but his touch was desperate, almost reverent. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was a collision. It tasted like grief and scotch and absolute desperation. It was the kiss of a man who was drowning and had finally found a piece of driftwood. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her hands sliding up to grip his shoulders, anchoring him to the ground. The cynicism, the professionalism, the fear, it all burned away in the space of a single heartbeat. He backed her against the wall near the door, out of the dim light of the bedside lamp. His mouth moved from her lips to her jaw, trailing down her neck. His breathing was ragged, his hands gripping her waist as if she were the only real thing in the room. Elena, he breathed against her skin, a confession and a plea wrapped into one word. I'm here, she answered, her hands buried in his dark hair. They stood there in the shadows, clinging to each other, while the fog pressed against the windows and the empire outside faded into nothing. The debts, the blood on the floorboards, none of it mattered. For a few stolen minutes in the dark, they were just two broken people trying to put the pieces back together. But as Vincent kissed her again, deeper this time, a quiet, rattling sigh came from the bed. Then absolute silence.
Elena froze.
She gently pushed Vincent back. The grief in his eyes was instantly replaced by a stark, terrifying realization. Elena walked over to the bed. She picked up Sophia's wrist, pressing 2 fingers to the translucent skin. She waited 10 seconds. 20. She looked up at Vincent, standing in the shadows. She's gone. Vincent did not cry. The tremor that had shaken his shoulders just moments before vanished, locked away behind a steel vault in his chest. He stood up slowly, stepping back from the bed. The vulnerable, desperate man who had just pinned Elena to the wall ceased to exist. The head of the Marchetti family took his place. Call Reyes, Vincent said. His voice was flat, devoid of any human inflection. He didn't look at his mother's body. He looked at the wall above the headboard. Tell him it's done. Elena stood frozen for a second, her lips still tingling, her pulse still hammering a frantic rhythm. The whiplash of his emotional withdrawal was violent. She nodded, stepping back into her clinical persona like slipping on a heavy lead apron. By 3 a.m., the house was swarming. Men in dark suits moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. There were no sirens, no flashing ambulance lights. Dr. Reyes arrived, signed the death certificate with a gold-plated pen, and handed it to a man Elena had never seen before. A private mortuary team wheeled a discreet silver gurney down the hall. Elena stood in the corner of the room holding her medical bag. Her job was over. The patient was gone. Vincent stood in the doorway watching the morticians zip the black bag closed. He hadn't looked at Elena since he stepped away from the wall. He was smoking a cigarette right there in the hallway, the ash falling onto the pristine mahogany floorboards. When the gurney rolled past him, he didn't move to touch it. He just took another drag. "Mr. Marchetti," Elena said quietly, walking over to him. "I've logged her final medications. The agency will send the closing paperwork tomorrow." Vincent exhaled a long plume of smoke. He finally looked at her. His eyes were completely dead. They were the eyes of a shark cruising through deep water. "Marco will escort you to your car," Vincent said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. He held it out. "Your final pay plus the bonus." Elena looked at the envelope. It was exactly like the one he had given her for saving Marco's life. A transaction. A severance. "Vincent," she started, her voice dropping. She reached out, wanting to touch his arm, wanting to find the man who had kissed her in the dark. He stepped back. The movement was small, but it felt like a door slamming in her face. "Thank you for your service, Elena. Do not come back to this house." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the East Wing. Elena stood alone in the hallway. Marco, pale but standing upright, appeared a few moments later. He gestured toward the front door. "I'll walk you out, ma'am." Elena drove down the winding hill in silence. The fog was thick, swallowing the rearview mirror. She threw the envelope onto the passenger seat. She didn't cry. She just felt an overwhelming, suffocating hollow in her chest. 3 days later, the rain finally stopped, replaced by a biting, bitter cold. Elena didn't get invited to the funeral. She found the details by scrolling through local obituaries. A private mass at Sacred Heart Cathedral, followed by a burial at Green Ridge Cemetery. She went anyway. She parked her cheap sedan a quarter-mile away and walked through the manicured grounds of the cemetery. She wore a plain black wool coat and kept her distance, standing under the shadow of a massive oak tree on a small ridge overlooking the grave site. The funeral was massive. A fleet of black SUVs lined the narrow cemetery roads. There were easily 200 people standing around the open grave. Politicians, police captains, and men with thick necks and tailored suits. Vincent stood at the front. He wore a heavy black overcoat. He looked like carved granite. From her vantage point, Elena watched the proceedings. The priest spoke. The casket was lowered. The crowd began to disperse, offering hushed condolences to Vincent, kissing his cheek, shaking his hand. He received them all with the same chilling, empty grace. Then the crowd parted. A man approached Vincent. He was older, walking with a silver-tipped cane. He wore a camel hair coat. Even from a distance, Elena could feel the sudden, violent tension snap into the air. Vincent's guards, Tomas, Dino, and a dozen others, shifted, their hands subtly moving toward their waistbands. The older man stopped in front of Vincent. He smiled. It was an ugly, sharp thing. He patted Vincent on the shoulder, leaned in, and whispered something in his ear. Vincent didn't flinch. He just stared the man down. The older man chuckled, turned, and walked back to his car. Elena didn't know who the man was, but she knew what he represented. The ceasefire was over. Sofia Marchetti was in the ground, and the wolves were circling. As the last of the cars began to pull away, Vincent stood alone by the grave. He picked up a handful of dirt. He tossed it onto the mahogany casket. Then he turned around. He looked directly up at the oak tree, directly at Elena. He knew she was there. He had always known. They stared at each other across 200 yards of frost-covered grass. Elena waited for him to gesture, to nod, to give her any sign that she should walk down that hill and stand beside him. Vincent turned his back, got into his armored SUV, and drove away. The agency fired her the next morning. Breach of contract, the director said, sliding a piece of paper across her desk. The Marchetti family paid out your contract in full, plus a massive non-disclosure settlement. But they requested you be removed from the active roster, effective immediately. Elena signed the paper without reading it. She walked out of the agency and into the gray afternoon. She had money now. The envelope Vincent had given her that night, combined with the settlement, was enough to pay off Ryan's remaining debts, cover her back taxes, and buy a house in the suburbs in cash. She was free. Felt like a prison sentence. She spent the next week packing up her apartment. She bought a one-way ticket to Portland, a fresh start. The boxes were stacked by the door. The flight was at 6 a.m. the next day. It was 9 p.m. when she realized she was out of packing tape. Elena threw on a jacket and walked down the stairwell of her decaying apartment building. The streetlights outside were flickering, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the wet pavement. The corner bodega was only 2 blocks away. She made it exactly 1 block. A black panel van slid to a stop at the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The side door slid open before the vehicle even fully stopped. 2 men jumped out. They didn't wear suits. They wore dark hoodies, jeans, and heavy boots. Elena's instincts flared. She didn't scream. She pivoted, digging her boots into the pavement and bolted toward the alleyway to her left. She was fast, but they were prepared. A third man stepped out from the shadows of the alley, blocking her path. He grabbed her by the front of her jacket. "Easy, nurse," he grunted, slamming her backward into the brick wall of the building. The breath left her lungs in a violent rush. Elena didn't panic. Her mind went clinically cold, the same way it did when a patient crashed. She looked at the man holding her. He had a jagged scar running up the side of his neck. She drove her knee upward, aiming for his groin. She connected. The man hissed, his grip loosening just enough. Elena twisted, bringing her elbow down hard on the bridge of his nose. Cartilage crunched. Blood sprayed across her jacket. She broke free, taking 3 steps toward the street. But the other 2 men were already there. Something heavy and blunt struck the back of her skull. The world flashed blindingly white, then pitched into a sickening, spinning darkness. Her knees buckled. She felt hands grab her by the arms, dragging her across the concrete. She was shoved onto the metal floorboard of the van. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared. Elena blinked, trying to clear the blood and double vision from her eyes. Her head was screaming. She was lying on her side in the dark. The van smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp metal, and sweat. "Tie her hands." A voice from the front passenger seat barked. It was the man she had hit. He sounded nasal, choked with blood. "Check her for trackers." Hands rolled her over. Someone pulled her arms behind her back, wrapping thick, biting zip ties around her wrists. "You're making a mistake," Elena gasped out, tasting copper. "Shut up," the man tying her said, checking her pockets. He threw her phone onto the floor and crushed it under his boot. "The boss wants Marchetti. Marchetti wants you." Simple math. The older man at the funeral with the cane. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. Vincent had paid off her ex-husband's debt from the crew at the docks. But he hadn't erased her from the board. He had just highlighted her value. The van took a hard left, throwing Elena against the metal wall. They were moving fast. "Call him," the scarred man said. "Tell him we have the nurse. Tell him to meet us at the rail yard alone or we start mailing him her fingers." Elena closed her eyes. "He won't come," she thought. "He walked away. He shut me out." The sound of shattering glass interrupted her thoughts. It wasn't a window. It was the entire back windshield of the van caving in. A heavy, deafening metallic crunch followed. The van violently lurched forward, fishtailing out of control. Elena was thrown into the air, slamming back down onto the floorboards. What the hell was that? The driver screamed. He's behind us. Shoot him, the scarred man yelled. Guns were drawn. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted inside the enclosed space of the van, the sound pressure rattling Elena's teeth in her skull. The men were firing out the blown-out back window. Another violent impact. Metal sheared against metal. The van was pushed sideways, the tires screeching uselessly against the pavement. The driver lost control. The van slammed into a concrete bridge pillar. The impact was catastrophic. The world flipped sideways. Elena was tossed like a rag doll, her shoulders slamming into a steel strut. Then dead silence, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the groan of bending metal. Elena opened her eyes. The van was on its side. She was tangled in the back. The man who had tied her hands was lying entirely still near the crumpled front seats. The scarred man was groaning, trying to drag himself out of the passenger window. Footsteps crunched on the broken glass outside. Slow, methodical. A shadow fell over the passenger side. A hand reached in, grabbed the scarred man by the hood of his sweatshirt, and hauled him out through the broken window. "Where is she?" a voice demanded. It was a voice that belonged to the devil himself. "She's in the back. She's alive," the scarred man screamed, sobbing. Two suppressed gunshots coughed into the night. The scarred man stopped screaming. The back doors of the van were wrenched open. The metal screamed in protest. Vincent stood there. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing tactical gear, a black plate carrier over a dark sweater. He had a suppressed pistol in his right hand. His face was splattered with blood that wasn't his own. His eyes were wide, feral, and utterly terrifying. He saw Elena lying on the floorboard. He dropped the gun. It hit the pavement with a clatter. He crawled into the wreckage, uncaring of the jagged glass ripping at his clothes. He reached her, grabbing her shoulders, pulling her up against his chest.
Elena! Elena!
"Look at me," he commanded, his voice shaking violently. She blinked up at him. She couldn't feel her hands. Her head was bleeding, but she saw his face. The armor was gone. The head of the family was gone. It was just Vincent, and he was terrified. He pulled a knife from his belt and sliced through the zip ties on her wrists. He ran his hands over her arms, her neck, checking for bullet holes. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I'm okay." He let out a ragged, broken sound. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I lost you," he breathed against her skin. "I thought they got you." "You told me not to come back," Elena said, leaning her heavy head against his shoulder.
"Elite," Vincent whispered.
He scooped her up in his arms, carrying her out of the wrecked van and into the freezing night air. "I've been parked outside your apartment every night since she died. I just couldn't let you see me." He carried her toward a massive dented black SUV parked sideways across the street. Tomas was standing by the driver's side, holding an assault rifle, scanning the empty street. Vincent put her in the passenger seat. He didn't let go of her hand. The safe house was a windowless concrete basement beneath a warehouse on the docks. It was cold, smelling of salt water and old dust. Elena sat on a metal folding chair under a harsh fluorescent bulb. She had a butterfly bandage over the cut on her hairline and a massive bruise blossoming on her cheekbone. Vincent sat on a crate opposite her. He had taken off the tactical vest. His black sweater was torn at the shoulder, revealing a nasty, jagged gash from the van's shattered windshield. He was bleeding sluggishly, but he refused to let her look at it until he was sure she didn't have a concussion. "I'm fine, Vincent," Elena said for the fourth time. She reached into the first aid kit Tomas had brought them. She pulled out a needle, thread, and a bottle of iodine. "Take the sweater off." Vincent stared at her. He slowly pulled the sweater over his head, wincing as the fabric pulled against the wound. His chest was covered in old scars, knife wounds, burn marks, the road map of a violent life. Elena stood up, moved between his knees, and started cleaning the cut on his shoulder with an iodine-soaked gauze pad. He hissed at the sting, his hands gripping her hips to steady himself. "The man with the cane," Elena said quietly, threading the needle. "Who is he?" "Victor Cassano," Vincent said, looking at her collarbone. "He runs the ports. He thought with my mother gone, I'd be distracted, weak. He thought he could leverage you to get me to hand over the distribution lines." "Leverage me?" Elena paused, the needle hovering over his skin. "How did he know about me?" "Because you're the only civilian I've ever brought into my house," Vincent said. He finally looked up into her eyes. "Because when I walked away from her grave, I looked at you instead of him. They see everything, Elena. They saw a crack in the armor." Elena pushed the needle through his skin. He didn't flinch. She pulled the suture tight. "So what happens now?" she asked, tying off the first stitch. "Cassano is dead," Vincent said. The words were delivered with chilling casualness. "Tomas and Marco are handling his lieutenants tonight. By tomorrow morning, his crew won't exist. There will be no retaliation." Elena kept stitching. She didn't ask how they were handling it. She didn't want to know the mechanics of the slaughter happening above them in the city. "And me?" she asked. Vincent's grip on her hips tightened. "I have a plane waiting at a private airstrip. A new passport. The name is completely clean. There is $3 million in an offshore account tied to it. You get on the plane, you go to Portugal, and you never look back." Elena stopped. She looked down at him. "You're sending me away. I am saving your life." Vincent's voice cracked, rising in volume. He let go of her hips and ran his bloody hands over his face. "Look at what happened tonight, Elena. They put you in a van. They were going to butcher you to get to me. I bring death to everything I touch. My father, my mother, and now you. Your mother died of dementia, Vincent," Elena snapped, her voice hard. "You didn't kill her. You kept her safe." "I can't keep you safe," he yelled, standing up. He paced away from her, the shadows of the basement clinging to him.
Llama monster, Elena.
"Do you understand that? I just executed 2 men in the street, and I didn't feel a damn thing. I am exactly what my mother thought I was." Elena stood by the metal chair. She looked at the blood on her hands. Vincent's blood. The blood of the men in the van. "I know what you are," Elena said quietly. Vincent stopped pacing. He looked at her, his chest heaving. "I knew what you were the day I walked into that house," Elena continued, stepping toward him. "I saw the blood on the floorboards. I clamped Marco's artery. I knew exactly whose money I was taking. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending I'm some naive girl who needs to be rescued from the big bad wolf." She closed the distance between them. She didn't flinch from his violent energy. She stepped right into it. "I've spent my entire life taking care of dying people," Elena said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I have held the hands of good men who died screaming and bad men who died peacefully in their sleep. The universe doesn't care if you're good or bad, Vincent. It just cares who is left standing at the end." She reached up, placing her hands on his bare, scarred chest. "I don't want the passport. I don't want the money. I want the man who didn't let me go." Vincent stared at her. The violent storm in his eyes broke, replaced by a profound, terrifying awe. He reached up, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her face up to his. "If you stay," Vincent whispered, his voice shaking, "you can never leave. I will burn the city down before I let anyone take you from me." "Then let it burn," Elena answered. Vincent kissed her. It was acclaiming, a blood oath sealed in the dark, smelling of iodine and gunpowder. He backed her up against the cold concrete pillar of the basement, his mouth devouring hers, his hands tracing the lines of her body as if mapping out his new religion. Elena wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her.